It's my pleasure today to introduce our Global speaker this week, Dr. Keisuke Fukuda from the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Keisuke did his undergraduate and graduate work at the University of Oregon. He was supervised in his PhD work by Jeff Woodman Edward Vogel and Edward O. He then did a postdoctoral period at Vanderbilt, supervised by Jeff Woodman and Jeff Shaw, prior to taking up his current position as an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, Mississauga in 2016. Keisuke's research focuses on visual working memory, which as turns out is a broad construct. You'll see it kind of encompasses vision, selective attention, short and long-term memory, which leads to what you'll see is a very rich research program. We've had some great discussions earlier today that captured that richness. So Keisuke's published papers in some of the typical places you might see some of the best perception cognition research, but also he's published in a variety of journals that clearly extend beyond that audience. Journals such as Psychological Science, the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience, the Journal of Neuroscience, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And I suppose that owes to the fact that Keisuke does both behavioral research, but he also applies EEG methods to answer questions about visual working memory. As impressive as is his research program, if you take a bit more careful look at a CV, there's so much more. In particular, I'm struck by somebody at your stage in career to have a CV that basically hits all the notes of a really budding, impressive academic. So Keisuke, he's highly active in the research community in terms of editing, reviewing papers, consulting editor, associate editor. He's given many talks like this one. I think I counted 14 in the last 3 years. He's highly engaged in graduate and undergraduate research supervision, which we would all appreciate around here. He's active in service both within his department and outside his department. So suffice to say, having joined U of T in 2016, Keisuke has sort of hit it out of the park as a budding academic in his first period of tenure at U of T. So we're very happy to have him. Enjoyed our conversation so far, and thanks for coming to speak with us.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for such a wonderful introduction. I feel I'm trying to find the real K person, because I don't think that's me. Thank you very much, Bruce, for such a wonderful introduction. I feel I'm trying to find the real K person, because I don't think that's me. I'm just a nerd who loves talking about science. And then also, I think one of the silver linings of COVID was that I was able to give talks everywhere in the world, so long as I'm okay to be in front of the Zoom. Right? So that's the secret of why I'm doing so much stuff. This is such an honor to be able to share some of my recent work that we conducted at UTM psychology department, looking at a dilemma, if you will, of visual working memory. So as we, I think, all agree, that our visual environment, no matter what aspect of life you cut, is very rich in information, visual information, maybe except for the time when you're sleeping. Right? Just to give you an example of this, let's say I finish my busy day, and on the way home I realize I have to stop by at the grocery store. So to buy some tomatoes, right? So the moment I walk into the grocery store door, what welcomes me is this beautiful array of produce. And here, my goal is to not just get distracted by how colorful the thing is after looking at the MATLAB screen for so many hours, right? You have to remember, I need to pick up tomatoes. So you need to represent what tomatoes should look like in your mind, so that way you can find yourself all the way in front of tomato to pick the best, most ripe tomato. After I do that, such a great feat, I go home, and then as soon as I get home, my two annoying but very cute kids will run to me and say, "Hey Dad, let's play till the dinner time." And then he would pick up his favorite picture book of Where's Waldo, right? And here, I'm sure everybody knows what the game is about. This is to find this guy with glasses and red striped shirt on, right? Again, to do that, what you have to do is to have a clear representation of what Waldo should look like, and then look through this really busy display and keep comparing what you have in mind to the perceptual input until you find that guy. And you have to do that before your kid does, because then you're going to have to sit through this annoying, "Hey, Dad, you suck," conversation. After that, I have a little bit of time to entertain myself. So I go up into my office, more like attic, and then I turn on my play computer and start playing video games. Here again, what I'm doing is the same. Even though I'm dealing with now a dynamic visual information, what I'm doing in essence is the same. I have to hold on to what I need to shoot, and I have to find what I need to shoot and shoot it, while not being distracted by other information, right? And then later on, you realize, shoot, I need to prepare a lecture for tomorrow, so I need to open up my computer and find a folder that says class exists there somewhere, right? Again, so that I can prepare my lecture. In all slice of things, right, even though information that hits my retina is very diverse, what I have to do is the same. I have to represent task-relevant information at that moment and find it in the environment through a series of perceptual comparison, right? What allows us to do is this visual working memory that I'm going to be talking about. Visual working memory is conceptualized as an online mental workspace where you can store a very limited amount of information actively so that you can use it to guide your behavior, right? Just going back to the first example. Oh, yeah.
Maybe just turn the Wi-Fi off.
Great idea. Thank you, thank you. It's unusual of me to not be on Wi-Fi, so computer is looking out for me. Like, don't you want to watch YouTube, right? Okay, so yeah, so looking at this slice, right, again, what I'm doing is have a very clear representation of what tomato should look like, right? You want to be very careful because it looks awfully like an apple, but you don't want to pick an apple to go home. My wife will be mad, right? So you have to hold a very accurate representation of what tomato looks like, and you want to keep it accurate through the process of comparison with, oh, that green long thing is a cucumber, not a tomato. The orange round thing is an orange, not a tomato. So the working memory has to be accurate and robust through these perceptual search, visual search that you have to go through. Naturally, I'm not the only one who's interested in this ability of mind. Many research has been conducted to examine the characteristic of working memory. The first thing that people have got interested in is the capacity of the system, right? To measure how much information you can hold in visual working memory, one of the classic tasks is called the change detection task. Here, participants are seated in front of the computer, and they're presented with an array of simple objects. In this particular case, a bunch of colored squares. Participants' task is very simple. They have to remember as many of those colored squares as possible because they will quickly disappear from the screen. After a short retention interval, one item would reappear, and the participant's task is to say whether it's the same item or different item compared to the same location a moment ago. In this particular example, since this used to be a red square, your answer should have been different. Does that make sense? Oh, I forgot to mention, if you have any clarification question, please stop me. I'll be happy to engage in that conversation. If the question is going to be something that I don't want to answer, I will tell you, let's wait till the end, and I hope that you will forget by the end of the talk. Okay? But please stop me at any point. Okay? So the beauty of this task is that it's very simple. This task has been used to test visual working memory of college students, university students, senior adults, or kids, or even animals, right? When we test this on a healthy young university students, what we typically find is something like this. Here, what I'm going to show you on y-axis is the accuracy of this task. X-axis is the set size, or the number of squares that were presented for the participant to remember. When the display contains 1 to 3 colored squares, the accuracy is very high, suggesting that people can remember 3 squares, no problem. But what happens after the set size exceeds the number 3, what you see is a monotonic drop in accuracy, suggesting that there seems to be some limit in how much visual information you can hold in mind. Another beauty of this task is with a simple set of assumptions, you can transform this accuracy function into a working memory capacity estimate, or how many colored squares worth of information people have to hold to show this accuracy function. I'm not going to go into the math. You can read it here if you want, but you don't need the understand this, if you were to do this transformation, what you see in the capacity is that it goes up to about 3, but after that, no matter how many more items you add on the display, that capacity estimate stays consistent. Based on this really robust finding, researchers have argued that our working memory capacity is really severely limited. It can only hold about 3 to 4 colored square worth of information. Right? This contradicts with our subjective experience of visual world, right? I can certainly see more than 3 faces here, right? Why colored square is so special? This is actually the reason why I got into this field. But that story is for some other time. Based on this, right, the ongoing debate in the literature, in the field right now, is it proper to say our capacity is limited by the number of the objects? Maybe there's some other way to better characterize this unit. This debate, in fact, is going on for at least last 2 decades. Some people say, yes, there is such a thing as item limit. You can remember about 3 things and that's it. Some people will say, no, there's no such a thing as discrete item limit. Instead, you should think of working memory as a continuous resource pool that you can divide in however many ways that you want, but the more division you do, the less each item gets, and therefore sometimes things get lost. Or some people say, it's stupid to think about the existence of magical number 3. It's just the result of interference with other information on the display or something that is in your memory, what have you. Similarly, people will say this is just a result of confusion with other information or neural noise, if you will. So as you can see, right, there's still, despite a robust finding like this, there's a lot of ongoing debate as to how we should best characterize this capacity limit. Today, I am not going to go in there because it's kind of becoming stale and boring. I'm going to be talking a little bit different aspect of working memory. But before getting into that, why do we even care about the simplistic ability of holding on to a simple set of visual information? Here what I'm going to show you is the distribution of working memory capacity that I collected over about 500 young undergraduate students at University of Oregon. And as you can see, the mean is right around 3, but at the same time, you see a really wide range of individual difference. This individual difference is very robust, but not just robust, it actually predicts a lot of higher order cognitive functions, including intelligence. So some people who can remember 4 squares tend to have a higher IQ score than the people who can remember 2 or less. So this is the reason why the last 2 decades or so, researchers have been really interested in figuring out, is there any way to make people remember more squares, right? So you probably heard about lumosity, cognitive training, and all that stuff. Yeah? Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about, like I said, I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of debate about what is the unit of working memory. What I'm going to really focus on today in the talk is the whole purpose of why we have working memory. Why do we have this memory system? Well, it's not just to hold on to information, right? We hold on to these information for a reason, so that way we can use it to guide our behavior. If you look back into the literature, there's not much research that happened in the past examining what happens to working memory when it serves its purpose, when it's used for perceptual comparison. That's not tomato, that's orange, and so forth, right? So we're going to be talking about what happens to working memory when it is used for perceptual comparison. Just to illustrate that point, again, I'm going to draw some example. Imagine yourself waiting for the traffic light to turn green in this busy street. And then the moment the light turns green, you notice that this guy in front of you drops his phone on the ground. Right? As a good citizen, you might go, oh shoot, I'm going to pick up the phone and give it to him. So you run up to the phone, you pick it up, but by the time you picked up the phone, the light has turned green and people moved on. What are you going to do? You're going to steal the phone? No. What you want to do ideally is to try to find that person so that way you can return the phone. How are you going to do it? You're going to use working memory, right? You're going to go, what does that person look like? And then you're going to try to compare that memory that you have to all the people right in front of you with the hope that your memory stays intact as you go through the comparison. So that's the first question that I'm going to ask today. Does working memory stay intact as it is used for perceptual comparisons. Because if it doesn't, then you may be returning the phone to somebody different. Right? Okay, well, dropping the phone on the screen is a psychologically valid experiment that we can do, but I didn't have that much funding, so my student and I decided to do a much simpler version of the experiment. So this is my former really fantastic thesis student, April Pereira. She's now a PhD student at Waterloo. I lost that competition. Anyways, okay, so in the baseline condition, what April and I asked people to do is to remember this single color patch. We present a color patch and ask them, try to remember that as clearly as you can over a short retention interval. After that, we present this color wheel and ask people to pick the color on the wheel that best describes the color that you just saw. After they pick the color, we present the color that they selected and provided another opportunity to fine-tune it if they want, and then also ask them how confident they are in their selection. They had 3 options. I'm very confident that this is the accurate color. I'm fairly confident that this is the color, that's a low confidence. Or they could also say, I have no idea, I'm simply guessing. Right? This is just to make sure that when we do the analysis, we can focus on the trials where they say, I am sure this is it. Right? In the critical condition, the trial started in the same way. We presented one item to remember, but critically, during the retention interval, we presented another color patch. We call this a perceptual probe. And at this point, what we ask people is simple. We ask them, is this probe similar or dissimilar to what you have in mind? Yeah? So we are having people use the working memory representation for the perceptual comparison. After they make the similar or not judgment, we ask people to report the original color in the same procedure. Okay, first we wanted to see how accurate visual working memory is, because if it's not accurate, there's no way that we can return the phone to that guy. Right? So here what I'm going to show you to characterize the accuracy of working memory representation, I'm going to show you something called the distribution of response offset. So basically, for every report, we looked at the difference between what they said as the color that they saw and the actual color. So difference between the actual value and the report. Right? If they are accurate, the difference should be 0. If they're way off, the response is going to be way off. Right? So here, if you were to look at the distribution of response for the baseline condition, where they didn't have to use the representation, what you see is nothing surprising, very nice peaky representation centered around 0. Indicating that their memory is very good. Right? Working memory is accurate. It's doing its job. The question is, what happens to this memory representation when we ask people to use it? Right? So now we're going to look at the trials where they saw the probe and they said, that looks similar to what I remember. What happens to memory representation? By the way, the probe that we presented was sampled from anywhere from 16 to 105 degrees away from the original target. When people call the probe to be similar, what we found is actual shift in that representation. As you can see, the distribution is now shifted in the direction of the probe that they thought was similar. Indicating that by doing this judgment, your working memory representation changed more similarly to the probe that you saw. Okay? Well, what happens if people call the probe dissimilar? Sorry for the color, hope you can see that cyan color there. What we found is much, much smaller bias in the direction of the probe. Just to quantify that bias in report, here what I'm going to show you is the mean response offset in the direction of the probe. When people call the probe similar, we see a reliable, massive bias in the direction of the probe. When people call that dissimilar, not much of that. Okay? So what this shows is that perceiving a new input as similar to working memory attracts the memory representation towards the new input. Okay? At this point, people might be wondering, is this really the judgment? What similarity is it? Is it just the physical similarity of the probe or the perceived similarity that's driving this effect? One way to get at that question is to look at a specific kinds of probe distance. So what we found in everybody's data is that for a given probe distance, sometimes people call that similar to target, but in other trials they call the same probe dissimilar. right? So those probe we can call ambivalent probe. And by looking at that, we can equate the effect of physical similarity of the probe, because it's the same probe distance, and focus on the subjective experience of comparing that probe. That's what we're going to do next. So here again, I'm just showing you the response offset distribution for the baseline. Now we're going to look at the trials where they saw the ambivalent probe and judged that to be similar for whatever reason. Here we see a reliable shift of memory representation in the direction of the probe, right? But the key question is what happens when people see exactly the same ambivalent probe but now call it dissimilar? If it is driven by physical similarity of the probe, whether they call it similar or dissimilar shouldn't matter, right? Because it's the same probe that they're seeing. But on the other hand, if it is the subjective experience that's driving this effect, then we should see no bias, right? Even though it's the same probe that they're seeing. Oh, sorry, so much buildup. This is actually the magnitude of the bias for ambivalent probe being similar. Now let's see what happens when they call the same probe dissimilar. You got nothing. What this shows is that this effect is not driven by the physical similarity of the probe, but what matters is what they felt when they saw the same exact item. So perceived similarity amplifies or drives the similarity-induced memory bias, not the physical similarity of that probe. This is cool scientifically, but if you really think about it, it's kind of scary. Right? Imagine the case when you witness a crime, you're going to hold on to that picture of the criminal, you're going to go to the police station and say, I saw this criminal. They might say, okay, tell me what he looked like. Was this guy like this or like that? That act could potentially change your memory of the criminal. So April, good-hearted student, was deeply concerned by this finding, and she wanted to find a way to cancel out this similarity-induced memory bias. And her approach was to maybe, if the perceptual comparison is so powerful, we may be able to cancel it by having people do another comparison, right? So here we had a baseline condition, one item to remember over delay, and then they report the color along with the confidence, nothing different from the original experiment. And she got two interesting conditions, sorry. One of the condition is called same-side probe condition. I'll explain why we call it same-side probe. Trial starts in the same way, right? Remember this color. And they're then given a pair of probe, and their job is to pick which one is more similar to the target. Just to illustrate how we did the probe selection, here's the color wheel from which we pulled off the target value. That's the target color. And this pair was sampled such that one of them is similar to the target, while the other one is very similar. So that way people have no problem about picking which one's more similar. After they say, hopefully, the pink is more similar, then we had people do another judgment. And here to show how we selected this probe, here's that probe selection. As you can see, the probe that is similar to the target actually came from the same side counterclockwise to the target as the first one. This is why we called it same-side probe. Does that make sense? Yeah? For two comparisons, we picked from the same side of the target. After that, we asked people to report the original target. Another key condition is the opposite side probe condition. Again, the trial starts in the same way. Remember this color. And the first pair is the same, right? Here's the first pair, how they were selected. Critically, though, for the second comparison, we sample the pair in this manner, such that the similar item now is sampled from the opposite side to the first similar item. Does that make sense? Yeah? So for this condition, pink is similar and orange is similar. Pink and orange is on the opposite side of the target, with the idea that by doing this, we may be able to kill the original bias that was induced by the first comparison. And they reported the target. Let's take a look at the data. Here's the working memory quality of working memory representation for the baseline condition. Again, people have very accurate memory representation. Here I'm showing you where the first similar probe was sampled. For the same side probe condition, we replicated the original finding of the similarity-induced memory bias. Memory gets more like the similar probe. Here's the magnitude of the bias. What happens when we do opposite? If we can cancel out the bias, we should see the distribution shifting back in the direction of the baseline condition. And that's exactly what we saw, right? So by biasing the memory again in the opposite direction, we can kill it, right? So good, right? It's not a problem that can never be fixed. If we are creative and careful in the series of perceptual comparisons, we can actually bring back the memory to the original state. Sim can be canceled out by additional similarity judgment. Yes?
Is it actually shifted the other way?
Great question.
It doesn't look symmetrical. It looks like you've shifted it.
Yes, there seems to be a little bit of a hint in this way. If you were to do a statistical comparison, it's not, there is definitely a trend. As you can see, it's not exactly 0, but it's not statistically different from 0. So I think what is going on is that it's the, two wrongs make it right kind of situation, right? You pull it in this way, you pull it back way, somehow we push it in the right direction. But if you pull it too strongly in the second one, it could go even further.
Question.
Yes?
Do you think the recency of the particular probe would modify it? So the more recent probe is, the more strong the effect?
Excellent question, right? So that's the reason why we didn't do a one judgment condition, right? Instead we did 2. If it's a recency, what we should have seen is the equal magnitude of bias for same and opposite. The fact that we get smaller one in magnitude for the different suggests that it's a sequential bias, if that makes sense. Yeah. So that's a fantastic point. Okay. So now what we wanted to do, because we're nerds, we wanted to figure out what's the computational mechanism that drives this effect. And this work was done with my awesome collaborator, Guillaume Bay at Arizona State University. So here we came up with 2 possible scenarios for the sim to happen. One possibility is that when you represent memory item and you see probe, you somehow mush these 2 representations together as a process of comparison. More scientific term would be representational integration. You integrate 2 representations into one, right? Another possibility is that these 2 representations are kept intact, but sometimes you make a mistake of reporting the wrong one. Instead of reporting the target, you report the probe, and therefore it gets shifted. So we created the computational model of these 2 things, right? So just to show you a cartoon version of this, imagine this is the memory item, this is the probe. When you do the comparison and judge them to be similar, you create this red representation, which is the integration of the black and blue. That's the representational integration hypothesis. Alternatively, right, probabilistic confusion would say you have the black memory representation and blue probe representations, but when you make the report, sometimes you report from the black, but some proportion of time you report from the blue. As a result, it gets a little tail in the direction of the probe. Right? So it makes a really distinct prediction about how the response distribution should look. So what we've done is we assume that these 2 models are right. We've created the best fitting model to the human data, which you see here, according to the representational integration model and probabilistic confusion model. And here's the best fit model. This looks pretty similar, doesn't it? What about the mixture model? This is the best job that mixture model could do in simulating this. The winner is clear. This one seems more similar to human data than that. Well, we of course did the formal model comparisons. No matter which metric we used to compare the model, it was the joint density or the representational integration model that seems to better fit the observed distribution. Okay? Here also we even did further. We looked at the relationship between predicted bias and observed bias across different physical distances, and we see a really nice relationship between predicted and observed, suggesting that JD model pretty accurately describes what's happening in the similarity-induced memory bias. Right? We wanted to even push it further, right? If the representational integration model is true, we can make a prediction about who should show a larger bias. People who have more poor representation of working memory have a larger integration window with a distant probe, resulting in larger bias. So we made that prediction. It should be the people with low quality working memory representation who show a larger bias. And that's exactly what we found. Y-axis here shows the measured bias magnitude. X-axis here is the precision of working memory representation in the baseline task. And what you see is higher the precision, smaller the bias. Again, so providing empirical evidence in support of the representational integration account. Okay, that's cool and everything, but maybe some of you, or maybe all of you here, might be wondering, what's so special about the perceptual comparison? Maybe it's enough to just show the probe, and that will drive the effect. There's nothing that shows the causality of the perceptual judgment. And that was exactly the question my graduate student asked me when I showed you this project. Such a brilliant student. Joey Saito, it's his work. He said, is there something causal that the perceptual judgment is doing? Because if you look into the literature, there are many instances where showing something, destructive information, can change your memory representation. So he wanted to go head on with that, right? Again, the same baseline task where they're presented with colored item. They have to remember it and then report, and confidence. What he did brilliantly was to introduce one condition, same physical presentation, but he changed the instruction depending on the block. So in the ignore block, when people saw an intervening probe, they were simply asked to ignore that second input. So this will simulate the effect of perceptual interference. Okay? This is a block design, so they know exactly what they have to ignore this. But in the compare block, where participants are told when they see intervening item, they have to do the judgment. They have to say whether it's similar or not compared to the original item. Again, this and this were blocked, so that despite they've seen the same thing, the only thing that they did differently was whether they ignored it or used it for comparison. Is that clear? Okay. So let's take a look. So here what I'm showing you is the magnitude of the bias that we observed in the ignore condition as a function of the probe distance, the distance between target and the probe. And as consistent with the previous literature, we see an attraction bias in the direction of the probe when they are simply ignoring the new input. Right? If perceptual comparison is playing a causal role in producing this bias, then what we should expect is a larger bias when they do the comparison. On the other hand, if the bias that we've been seeing is nothing but a perceptual interference, then compare bias should be identical to ignore bias, right? That's what we got. So we see a clear, statistically robust amplification of the bias when people have to do a comparison. What this shows is that the perceptual comparison has a causal role in manipulating the amplitude of the bias. It's not just a perceptual interference. Right? And we then wanted to ask the same question of, is it the physical distance of physical similarity or perceived similarity by doing the same analysis, where we only look at the probe distance that resulted in both similar and dissimilar judgment. When we isolate these probe distance and look at the magnitude of bias in the ignore condition, there's a small but reliable bias in the direction of the probe. Right? Question is what happens between these two conditions. Again, if it is the perceived similarity, we should see a larger bias when they see that same probe and say similar than when they see the same probe and say dissimilar. Clear result. Right? Again, You get this bias, larger than ignore, only when they call it similar. When they see that probe and say, oh, that looks dissimilar, it's qualitatively identical to simply ignoring that probe. Okay? Again, it is your subjective experience that's driving this effect. Okay, so that's cool, right? And then Joe doesn't stop. That's the student. The good student will keep you busy. He was, okay, this is very cool, but we've been only showing this with the boring stimuli, like colors. We also did the same thing with the shapes, but that's the extent, right? But if you want to really talk about this happens in real life, explaining the memory phenomena, we need to be able to show this with more complex real-world stimuli. So that's what he did. He now had people remember a real-world stimuli, colored ones. So they would present a colored real-world stimuli and repeated essentially the experiment. Remember the color of this backpack? Report it in confidence, right? The critical condition, we try to replicate the same side, opposite side manipulation. So they see the backpack and they do the comparison twice, right? Which one's more similar? Which one's more similar to this one? And then report. Does that make sense, what they had to do? Great. So let's take a look. Again, memory representation is very accurate when they are not used for perceptual comparison. When they do the same side probe, we see again the shift in the direction of the similar color. When we ask opposite side, no bias. Again, there's a similar, little small potentially bias in this way, but this is due to the fact that we're inducing it sequentially. So yes, this sim occurs not just for a simple color patch. It can happen with a real world object. I know what you guys are going to say, but it's still the color memory. You just use the backpack as the background. It doesn't really show the ecological validity. I know. So we wanted to do that with face, right? Face similarity is not defined by a single surface value of pigments, right? It's got nose, eyes, ears, mouth, not hair in this case. But we wanted to show if the same thing happens with the face stimuli. This was the work done by another brilliant thesis student of mine, Jarek Tail. Okay, so baseline condition, we presented an artificially generated face and asked them to remember it as precisely as possible over a short delay interval. And then we actually prepared a face wheel. They had to choose which face is exactly that. It's hard to see now, but in the actual experiment, they can actually see all these faces. And then they can also report the confidence. Okay? In the critical comparison condition, we present a face, but during the retention interval, we presented two faces. One of them is 45 degrees away from the target. The other one is 180 degrees away. And their job is to pick which one's more similar. And then they report the face. Okay? So when we are running this experiment, we wanted to make sure that this happens on as many artificial faces that we can create. So we used this specific software, FaceGen, and created all possible kinds of race by gender combination. At that point, when we bought this software, there were 4 races that we could make with 2 genders. So we wanted to see whether it happens in all possible combination of them. When we used the African faces, we found a reliable bias. East Asian, same. European, same. And South Asian, the same. Okay? So it doesn't matter. Any face we chose, we found a reliable similarity-induced memory bias. Okay? So it's not just color. The similarity, so long as you perceive similar, whether the similarity can be computed over a single surface value or combination of multiple features, we can induce similarity-induced memory bias. Okay, to summarize what I've talked so far, visual working memory can be biased as a consequence of its usage in perceptual comparison, particularly when you perceive the input to be subjectively similar. This happens, or one thing I didn't really focus on, is that this happens even when people indicate high confidence in the accuracy of memory. When we first ran this experiment, we thought, well, this bias probably is a guessing strategy or something. When you're not sure, you're going to rely on the probe that you saw. If that's the case, right, those bias should happen when people report low confidence. Right? I'm not sure, so I'm going to rely on the probe. If that's the whole source, then when we only look at the trials where people say, I'm 100% sure, we shouldn't see it. But that's not what we found. We see as robust of a bias even when people indicate high confidence in the accuracy. This happens with real-world stimuli like objects and also faces. We haven't tried it with hairs, but I think it'll happen with hairs too. Okay, so we're going to change the gear a little bit. So far I've been talking about working memory only from information coming through the front door. For working memory researchers, when we study working memory, we often present stimuli visually and ask people to remember. But if you look into introductory textbook or go to Atkinson Shiffrin, the inferential memory model, working memory also has a back door. Information can be loaded from the long-term memory. Right? Just to illustrate that point, let's bear with me talking about my typical weekend leisure time. I open up Amazon and start looking for things that I want to buy, right? So I'm walking, let's say I watch this cool jacket, and I'm like, oh, that looks cool, I want to buy them. But I don't stop, right? I continue on browsing through things I want to buy if I'm rich. And I encounter this boat, and I'm like, oh, that's so cool. I love fishing, by the way. I bought kayak, that's the best I can do right now. One day, I'll get a boat. I load it up into working memory and think about one day I'll get a boat. And then go on and realize, wait, with my budget, I can't really buy the boat. And I realize, maybe I can buy the jacket that I saw. But now, that jacket is not in front of me, so I have to load it up into working memory through my long-term memory. Right? So in order for me to find, what did that cool jacket look like? I want to buy it. I need to go back into offline storage and go, oh, what did it look like? And load it back into our online memory system. So what this shows is that working memory, to study working memory, it's not sufficient to just characterize the information coming from front door. We need to think about how information loaded from long-term memory behave through perceptual comparison. So that's the work that, again, Joe did, right? So here, I'm so happy that I'm not a participant in the study. What Joe had people do was to have people remember 240 pictures of real-world object. They showed them 6 times, so they actually saw it a long time, many times. So make sure that they have a good long-term memory representation of those items. So cool jacket, beanbag, notebook, key, and so forth. After participants learn all these pictures, then Joe had people do the retrieval task. In the retrieval task, we presented a grayscale version of those objects and asked them, do you remember seeing this before? And after that, we had people recall the color of that item. So if you remember having seen this notebook, they would say it was this brownish color. Make sense? So this is the typical baseline condition. The critical condition, we call it bias condition, starts again the same way. We present the grayscale version, ask them, do you remember seeing this? And if they say, if I remember, then we present with a 2-colored version of this, asking them which one is more similar to what you originally remember. After they pick which one's more similar, they would do the report. Okay? Importantly, Joe had participants do this recall task twice. Once on the same day as the encoding had happened, and also the next day, 24 hours later, the encoding. Okay? I'll explain why that was critical. First, Joe wanted to see whether the information retrieved from long-term memory is susceptible to this bias. Maybe information that's so hot is susceptible to bias, right? Information you just let it enter through front door is the only thing that's malleable. Once it's in long-term memory, it may not change, right? So to get at that, he looked at the item that was biased on day 1, the same day as encoding, and we found a reliable SIM. So even though you encoded it into long-term memory and retrieved it before the comparison, that's susceptible to bias. Okay? Then he wanted to ask, does this bias amplify itself if there's a longer delay? Imagine you encode something today, and tomorrow, if I ask you, do you remember that thing? Which one was it like? Is the bias now larger because there was 24-hour time between encoding to the comparison? To ask that, he looked at the item that was only biased on day 2. The item that was never tested on day 1, but only tested on day 2. Found a larger bias, suggesting that this delay increases the susceptibility to this bias. Okay? The really cool thing that he asked, I think, in this project was this question. Right? So we show that we can induce bias, but maybe this is just a short-lived thing. Since you did the comparison now, it has a really temporarily limited effect on your report. Right? Maybe if you wait it long enough, your memory goes back to the original state. Alternatively, once you make the judgment, your memory is permanently changed and you're stuck with the biased representation. More scary situation. To get at that, what he's done is to look at the item that was biased on day 1 and made sure that these items are only recalled on day 2, meaning that there was no additional perceptual comparison on day 2. They're simply presented with the grayscale again, and they just reported the color. No additional comparison. If SIM is a temporary phenomena, right, after the 24-hour delay, this bias should go back down, right? But once you make the judgment, it makes a permanent damage to your memory representation, then they will report the same biased representation on day 2. Right? Dun, dun, dun. That's what we found. Right? So what this shows is that once bias is introduced, this biased memory representation seems to stay, at least for 24 hours. Right? Scary. Okay, so that's scary. Now what we wanted to do is maybe this retrieval effect, this sustained effect, is specific to the context in which you are retrieving the information. If you open up the long-term memory literature, memory retrieval can be highly context dependent. Right? The famous battery diving experiment. If you were to have people remember things underwater, they can retrieve that underwater, but not somewhere else. Right? Maybe the SIM is also retrieval Q specific. Right? If I ask you about the same item in a very different way, your memory may be preserved. That's again the experiment, I think, 3 of his thesis, undergraduate thesis. He was crazy. He was very productive. Okay. So to do this experiment, first Jarek had participants encode profile. What I mean by profile is the association of a face along with the name and the major, right? So we presented a person's face and asked participant, what's the name of this person and what does this person study? The participant's job is to pick one of the names and also one of the major, right? Oh, they don't know the right answer, they have to figure it out by trial and error. Right? After they pick, we provide the feedback, which one's right. We repeated this until they get it right. This person is Lisa, and she studies geology. We made sure that people learn that profile for 8 people. Right? So they went through multiple iteration until the participant got 8 profile down. After that's done, right, Jarek had participant do a recall practice task, where Jarek presented one of the, I'm going to call it Q now, one of the attribute of that face, and asked the participant, do you remember the face of the person who studies geology? Right? So here, they're using the Q to retrieve the long-term memory. Right? Yeah, oh, geology, oh, that girl was studying geology. And after that, we present, so that girl, which one does she look like? Yeah. And then did the face wheel, report the face, right? By now it's pretty straightforward. But the critical thing that Jarek did is that in this practice phase, he always had people use one of that Q, right? For this phase, Jarek asked participant to only use geology as a Q, leaving Lisa as an unpracticed Q. Does that make sense? Okay. So that way, we can use Lisa later on to see the generalizability of this bias effect. In the final recall task, as you may know, we use both Qs now. Sometimes we use the name, sometimes we use the practiced Q to trigger the retrieval of the face. Are we all clear? Please don't hesitate to ask any question if it's not clear. Good? Okay. So let's see what happens. This shows the bias that we observed in the recall practice phase, where we did the comparison immediately before the recall. Not surprisingly, we see the bias. At this point, it's not it's an old news. What was really interesting was what happened in the final recall. When we trigger the retrieval by the cue that was used in the practice, right, we found the same bias. It generalized over time, but this doesn't really tell us about the cue generalizability yet. To answer that, we really have to look at the unpracticed attribute, Lisa case, right? If the memory bias causes universal damage to the profile memory, then it really doesn't matter how you access that damaged representation. On the other hand, if this bias is in some way retrieval cue specific, then the Lisa's face might be intact because the bias was not caused when information was accessed by the name Lisa. Yeah, sucks, right? So what this means is that once you change the memory through one cue, other cue doesn't survive. The memory itself is now permanently changed, right? The same seems to generalize across memory retrieval that's triggered by different cue. So to summarize all I've talked about, visual long-term memories are also subject to SIM when retrieved into working memory. This seems to suggest that by bringing more information into working memory, you are reactivating representation so that it's malleable. It can interact with the new information that comes in. Right? Happens with real-world objects and also human faces. Once it's induced, this effect seems to be lasting, at least for 24 hours. We haven't tested any longer, but yeah, it'd be interesting to test longer, but I right now can't see any reason as to why this will revert back down with a longer delay. This effect generalizes across different retrieval contexts, right? So once you induce the memory distortion using as one cue, the other cue is also damaged. So retrieving long-term memory into working memory risks lasting memory distortion that propagates across retrieval cues. I talked a lot, so I'm just going to try to summarize what I've been trying to propagate today. Right? To really understand working memory, right, why it's so important in defining our intelligent behavior, it's not really sufficient to just study how much can we stuff into this memory system or how good the memory representation is. It is important to study that, but that's only one aspect of working memory. To really understand how working memory serves our everyday life, we need to think about how we evaluate the quality of the representation and how we decide to use it, and also the consequence of it, right? Everyday life is not like an experiment where everything is done in a single trial, right? There's a consequence in everyday life in using memory. So we need to really understand what's the downstream effect of a simple working memory operation. Comparing working memory with subjectively similar input risks lasting and generalizing memory distortion. And this actually, I think, reveals the dilemma of working memory. When I first saw this, I'm like, okay, to keep my working memory, I should just not use it. And then I'm like, wait a minute, if I don't use working memory, what's the point of holding that information, right? So what that means is that we have fucked, right? But then I realized, no, that's not true, right? Does this mean all the working memory research is wrong? Right? Because to study working memory, we need to measure it, so we need to ask people to make some sort of report. But by making the report, we are contaminating memory signal. Then maybe all the research that we build up is wrong. I don't think so, right? I think this memory signal distortion is not a bug, but the feature of the memory. We need to actually study this feature to understand how memory behaves in everyday life, because that's what we do in everyday life. Yeah, I'm very good at coming up with excuse. And so that's why I'm still happy to continue on with my memory research. Right? Okay, what are we doing now? Well, obviously, those working memory distortion has practical consequences. Right? There are many cases in everyday life where memory accuracy of memory representation can determine other people's lives. Right? Eyewitness testimony. There's a lot of research that's going on, and in fact, there's a rich research in long-term memory in eyewitness testimony. What we are trying to do is to connect this mechanistic model, starting from working memory, to explain these everyday phenomena in misinformation effect, or false memory, and what have you. Also, similarity judgment is not the only subjective experience that we feel when we use memory for comparison. Right? One of them is Nutley Portman, the other is Keira Knightley. I can't tell apart. Right? So what that means is that sometimes when you do comparison, it's not similarity that you experience sameness. Right? What happens to memory representation when you experience sameness? Is it the same integration or some other mechanisms? Our recent work that we are working on submitting now suggests that these are two separable consequences for these two subjective experiences, such that when you think similar, you get the integration. When you think it's same, you get swapping. You're going to change the representation completely to the new item. It's a two mechanistically different explanation of the bias. This, I think, ties nicely into some of the classic literature suggesting that people remember yield sign instead of stop. Right? These phenomenon is really difficult to explain using the integration, because how do you integrate yield and stop? Yield? No, right? It's really the swapping. So I think this realization of the sameness is a really good way to explain these misinformation phenomena that has been observed in the past literature. Lastly, we love to extend our work into different modalities. Right? Working memory is not just for vision. It can remember auditory information or even tactile information. Do we see similar things if you were to change the modality? Also, before COVID, we are testing the same effect with the older adults. I'll be really interested to see whether this happens across the lifespan. If so, who's more susceptible to such memory distortion? On that note, I'd like to thank you all for your close attention, and also these are the people who did the work, and the funding agency, and the lab. Thank you.
Original anchor.
Correct.
Right? What if they make the same judgment to the probe? Does that have that same type of bias? You're forcing them to remember it with the same weight as the original anchored item.
Okay, that's an excellent question, right? So we try to get at that question by having a condition where we ask people to remember both, right? And then that way we can also look at the bias that happens to the probe, right? And the answer is yes, we get the bias, but if you ask people to remember both, the magnitude of the bias is not the same as when we just do the comparison. The reason is when you try to remember both items, right, there's an opposing force to keep the two items separate. So now you get the repulsion bias acting against the comparison. So it's not the same as remembering both. The other way to answer your question is to look at, does the perception of the probe change because you have information in mind? There's a work there's a rich literature behind that phenomenon called serial dependence. Your perception of the current is dependent on the past perception. I think the SIM can provide a unifying mechanism to explain all these perceptual serial dependence and also the memory of that. I hope that time answers the
Thank
question.
you.
Yes?
I wanted to ask you about the adjustment phase of your experiment. Does that matter?
Actually, no. The bias is already there when you pick the seed. The reason why we wanted to have the adjustment condition is, as you saw, the wheel, depending on the stimulus, we can't really provide all the values, right? So if that's the case, then they may actually choose to report the anchor value as opposed to what they have in memory, and that could be the source of the bias. We wanted to avoid that. That's why we had the adjustment period. But no matter which data we use, pre-adjustment or post-adjustment, the bias effect is Thank you for the question. Yes?
I have two questions. The first is probably really naive and everyone else in the audience knows the answer, but I don't. If we want to put something in working memory, what helps more, looking at it many times or looking at it for a longer period of time?
That's a fantastic question. I think we share the same wavelength. So we ask that question not necessarily for the working memory, but for the long-term memory, right? What happens is that if you keep the viewing duration consistent, right? Splitting that into multiple occasion encoding opportunity has a much larger effect on increasing the accessibility to that memory representations.
Okay, so many times
Many
is
times.
better than a long
Yes,
period.
that increases the accessibility to that memory.
My second question is that as much as you want to increase ecological validity, we look at objects not on a white background, but in a complex
Yes.
backgrounds,
Yes.
right? And what happens to our working memory when you actually embed these images on more realistic or just on complex backgrounds?
Fascinating question. So I think the working memory performance will depend on the task that they are in. If they have to focus on the object and ignore the scene, you get the comparable effect. But if you the moment that you make the background also a key information to remember, the performance would go down, if that answers your question. Well, another way to ask that question is to increase the complexity of the stimulus that they have to remember. The capacity estimate, interestingly, is equivalent, if not larger, for a more complex item than the simple color stimulus.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So it's of course interesting that the effect depends on perceived similarity.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you've thought about or tried to push around people's perceived similarities. So one example I had is if you were doing it with faces, you could give the comparison face and say, this is John after he got a nose job or something, or like this is John's cousin or something, getting them to think this is the same person versus this is a different person, and push around that, make them think it's similar and then integrate.
Now that's an interesting, really cool manipulation. We haven't really thought about that creative one, but what we are trying to do is something that's known as Dodds effect, right? So when in the eyewitness testimony, you can manipulate the memory report accuracy by not changing the target itself, but the foils. If you add really different foils, you can increase people's confidence. This must be the guy, because the other guys look so different. So we are planning on using those manipulations to induce the similarity, but I don't have the actual data to speak to that just yet. Yeah.
So your title is about working memory, but the effects you show up in long-term memory. So why is it not just memory, right? This is an old debate in the literature. We have one memory system.
Yes.
But you grew up in an environment that's very working memory. So what are your views on a one memory system?
I am a full believer of embedded processing line. So one memory system. The representation itself is shared between working memory and long-term memory. What's different is the state at which, right? To put information in working memory, it's not that you're creating different representation. You're making that representation in a different activated state, right? So the reason why I call this working memory is that this act of increasing the activation makes the representation more malleable, whether it's the information that's coming from perception or from long-term memory. So the way that I define working memory is not a different representation, but it's the state, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I guess in that context, your result that
Is memory.
long-term memory is similarly biased as working memory is like when you presented it, it's like, oh, that's really surprising. But in the context of one memory system,
It
not
should
as-
happen. It should
Yeah.
happen just like this,
Yeah.
right? I think one thing I would just promote is the lasting consequence, right? I don't think whether it's a separate memory system, a single memory system, doesn't necessarily make a prediction about whether the effect will sustain.
Yeah.
The finding that it sustains is something interesting that ties into this memory reconsolidation literature and all that crazy things.
Yeah.
But yeah, going into that will be, I think, fun for my graduate students. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Hi, this might sound like, it is an odd question, it doesn't just sound like an odd question. I'm wondering, so you show these bias effects in memory, and I'm wondering, maybe they have virtually no effect on us. Because I'm thinking like your tomato example. I don't care if my memory for the color of a tomato is biased by 10%, I'm not gonna confuse it with a cucumber. So, I guess my question is, in the real world, what is working memory for? Is it for remembering a particular instance of a category, or just to, know generally what a tomato is, or what a sparrow is, and it's good enough? These biases, there's not enough selective pressure to make it more accurate or less susceptible to these things.
I agree 100%, right? This 15-degree effect is what kind of consequence does it have? After all, your memory was reddish. That's good enough in some occasions, but I will push it a little bit against that. Depending on your perceptual sensitivity, right? I love fish. I can tell all the different kinds of trout, right? But if I ask my wife, those trout will look all similar to each other. Their memory representation is not as accurate as mine. In those cases, I think the sim can have severe consequences. Imagine a case where you witness a crime, right, of the people you're not familiar with. If your similarity judgment is large, that could result in convicting a different person. Yes.
I want to make a comment on that. First of all, if you're an expert, we know that your sensory systems get better too.
Mhm.
So, one question I had was, if you practice at this task, or the color discrimination test, you get better. But the other thing on face identification, we're awful at identifying faces, even in the absence of memory. I mean, there's lots of work to show that even though people think they're really good, we're terrible.
Yes.
So you can get those effects even in the absence of memory.
Right. I think that comes down to what you mean by memory, right? Do we need the delay, right? We could.
No, I could show you a picture.
Yes.
And then I could say, is that guy in here? 10 other pictures. And that is and you can be an expert. You can get the Glasgow police force who's trained on these things. And they're awful at that task.
Yes.
They're above chance, but it's a really hard task.
I agree 100%. So the point that as a biased working memory researcher, I would say even in those single glance moving away, you still need mental inner representation of the perceptual input. And I call that maybe a memory system. In that sense, this is where I'm coming from. Everything involves certain kind of memory, but I think the point is right? Doesn't have to involve delay for this effect to take place. And for the stimuli that we have no expertise, I think the sim effect can have a real life consequences.
Great. I've got two questions, so might not be related, but let's start with first. So first, quick question. So you have the task in ask participant to judge. Is it similar to the target that you just saw? Have you manipulated duration, like between the probe task and the exposure to the target? And with this, if you have manipulated, I believe so, any relation between the duration of the delay with the memory bias?
Yep. So the biggest manipulation that we've done is the 24-hour delay condition, where we have people remember the items and then we have them come back 24 hours later and do the comparison. And what we found is a larger bias effect. And this can be explained by the similar kind of idea that more poor your representation is, the larger the bias is. The longer you wait, memory becomes less precise, therefore the larger bias.
Yeah, but that's also a little bit too long, I would say 24
Gotcha,
hours. But
gotcha.
then you can come into the fight with, this purely can explain by working memory
Okay.
capacity versus the interaction between long-term and short-term. So I'm thinking maybe within the scale of 10 to 30 seconds.
Yeah. No, that we haven't done yet. But yeah, that would be interesting. Actually, there are some, not the attraction bias, but the repulsion bias, right? If you have people remember two things, people try to keep them more separated over the delay. So there are work that suggests exactly what you're saying. Maybe the bias magnitude might change over the course of seconds. So yeah, that would be an interesting thing for us to test.
Okay, thank you. Second question is about faces. I think it's great. You have faces, though those faces look very fake. Given that we got one of the papers rejected just based on using those faces, same software we paid. So my question is, it's great that you've shown that different ethnicity, different races show similar comparable memory biases. And so curiosity-wise, is what about participant? Or they same race to certain faces or they're mixed? Have you looked into instead of looking at individual faces, but looking at contrast between the faces of familiar or represent for those participants versus by distance?
Yeah, no, exactly. We wanted to do that. So we were at the GTA, great place. The student body is diverse, but at UTM, not quite. There's a really Asian-heavy background, so we don't really have a balanced sample to look at home race versus outside race yet.
The reason why I ask is because from face perception literature, there's a very long history of saying there's deficits into recognizing, remembering faces not that represent the environment, so-called algorithm effect. So that's something called relate to how memory might be biased or efficiency is being biased by how familiar you are with the faces. And so just my naive kind of predictions, we probably have a strong bias towards the faces that you're familiar with. So that's how your memory system has been trained from development perspective. But on the other hand, if you can recruit participants from Japan and show them black faces, which is politically correct, you probably don't see that much. So I'll be very, very curious to see.
Actually, that makes two opposing predictions, right? According to the memory quality account, right, I think there is enough evidence to suggest that your memory for own race is more precise than outer race, right? If that's the case, we will see a larger bias for outer race. But if your familiarity is driving the assimilation effect, then you will see the opposite. So I think that's a really interesting project that actually we do.
Okay.
Yeah, great idea. Thank you.
I also have two thoughts. My first one is in this spirit of trying to cancel out this bias, right? You allow the participants to kind of create the stimulus that best matches their memory. But now that you know that the average is 15-degree bias, if you're just given the biased one versus the original, are they accurate or do they still choose the biased one now?
Fantastic question. Yes, they choose the biased one. We actually ran another experiment because that actually answers the question, is this specific to the recall procedure? Right. So we created the 2 AFC version where we present the biased one and the actual one. We can increase the likelihood that people wrongfully choose the biased one.
Right, so their memory itself is now
exactly. It's not the strategy.
Permanently changed. Okay, and then the other thought is, so you've shown the integration model and this bias of about 15 degrees, but perhaps this is what's necessary for memory to be functional, because every time I meet you, you'll look a little bit different, and I don't want to not recognize you despite those changes. So what you're capturing is what's actually optimal for recall.
Exactly. Again, a fantastic point, right? So we can live in this world because of this uncertainty or the fuzziness of memory. That's how we can maintain the continuity of ever-changing visual environment. So yeah, that kind of ties into the idea about this is not an error but a feature type of argument. That this is what makes us alive in this world. Right? But we need to be careful. This feature that works most of the time can actually cause grave consequences if it was presented in the wrong case, like the eyewitness testimony. So I think it's still important to test where it functions, where it fails, and if so, we need to be aware of that. Yep.
Great.
We're gonna get Paul last question.
Might be good to someone else. Mine's a curiosity question. On your lab logo, what is the RTM to UTM stand for?
Oh, that one. This is my motto. This is my very optimistic way of. This is why I want to go. Read the mind, right?
Read the mind.
Understand the mind to lead the mind. So by understanding the mind, we can maybe lead the mind to a better place. Yeah. That's not a password for my life.
I thought it was two University of Toronto Mississauga.
Oh.
I was just trying to figure out what the RTM stood for.
I should have thought more. Can you ask again?
Okay, just before we wrap up, I want to remind everybody there's a social wine and cheese upstairs, second floor. Please come up and let's continue the conversation. And let me now just thank Keisuke for a wonderful talk and for coming to speak with us.